Hello, good day class. In this video lecture, we will be discussing about your immune suppression and tolerance. So, ano ba ang ibig sabihin ng immunologic tolerance? So, your immunologic tolerance is defined as the unresponsiveness to an antigen that is induced by previous exposure to that antigen. So, the term tolerance will apply to many layers of protection imposed by our immune system. So what is the purpose of this? This is so that there will be prevention of the reaction of the cells and antibodies against the host components. So meaning individuals or us should tolerate and not respond aggressively to our own antigens. And even though the purpose of our immune system is to attack pathogens or cells from other individuals, it should be able to tolerate our own antigens and structures. So dati, it was thought that tolerance was just mediated by elimination of cells that were autoreactive. So yung mga cells that were developed and was noted to react with antigen of our tissues were eliminated. But now it was noted that your tolerance or the tolerance of our immune system are not just elimination of autoreactive cells, but is an active participation of the different pathways of our immune system, na merong self-recognition of self-antigens and rather than just ignoring the self, the immune system as a whole recognizes and protects self-antigens and beneficial microbes. So we have several pathways in our immune system, just like the regulatory T cells, your Treg. So these are lymphocytes that recognize self-proteins with high affinity, and it inhibits the immune response. So it was noted that these also play an important role in maintaining immunologic tolerance. So different general features of our immunologic tolerance include the antigens that induce tolerance, and we refer to that as your tolerogen. So you remember last video lecture natin doon sa antigens, we have what we call tolerogenic antigens. So we distinguish them from immunogens because immunogens will generate an immune response. So this tolerance to self-antigens is a fundamental property of our normal immune system. So if there is a failure for this to continue or to pursue, there is a development of autoimmune diseases. So kaya meron tayong mga specific autoantibodies for specific immune disease. So that happens when our immune system fails to recognize the antigens as self. So one of the main means to avoid self-reactivity is sequestration or partitioning of antigens away from the immune cells. So, di ba yung eyes natin are immunologically special because hindi siya masyadong heightened ang immune response. So, yung parts of our eye like the anterior chamber and lens are considered as your sequestered sites. So, meaning there is no or there is only little lymphatic drainage. So, the tissue-specific antigens in the sequestered sites or privileged sites are isolated from the rest of the immune system. So this sequestration allows our antigens to evade encounter with reactive lymphocytes during normal circumstance. That's why it's not difficult to transplant certain parts of the eye like the cornea, because it does not stimulate rejection. So what other features of the immunologic tolerance do we have? So yung ating tolerance results from the recognition of antigens by specific lymphocytes. Diba? So hindi na siya purely elimination lang. So your self-tolerance may be induced by mature self-reactive lymphocytes, and that happens in the generative lymphoid organs if we say central tolerance, and at peripheral sites by mature lymphocytes. So that is your peripheral tolerance. So we should be able to tolerate our own self-antigens, and note that the central tolerance occurs during maturation of your lymphocytes in the primary lymphoid organs. And the primary lymphoid organs are where all developing lymphocytes pass through at a certain stage, and they will encounter antigens that either lead to cell death or replacement of a self-reactive antigen receptor with a new one. So either yung cell or yung receptor yung i-change. Now, your peripheral tolerance naman will occur as a consequence of recognizing self-antigens. So, mature lymphocytes, kasi yun yung nasa peripheral sites or secondary lymphoid organs, they will become incapable of responding to that antigen, or induced to die by apoptosis. Or, pwede rin silang actively suppressed by the regulatory T cells. So, it happens sometimes that self-antigens can be ignored by the immune system. And yung foreign antigens din, in the absence of co-stimulatory signal, may inhibit immune response. So that is also inducing tolerance by specific lymphocytes. Now, we go to specific parts of the immune system. So, meron tayong T-cell tolerance. In this illustration, you will see general immunologic tolerance by T cells and B cells. So, yung central tolerance, again, doon sa primary lymphoid organs natin, yung thymus and bone marrow. So, it can happen through apoptosis or change in receptor, or yung development of regulatory T cells or T lymphocytes will cause suppression to promote immunologic tolerance. So the tolerance in the CD4 plus helper T lymphocytes is a very effective way of preventing immune response to protein antigens, because the helper T cells are necessary to induce both cell-mediated and humoral immune response to proteins. So yung developing lymphocytes with receptors that recognize self-antigens are eliminated here in the thymus and the bone marrow before they are allowed to mature. So yan yung tinatawag natin na negative selection. So the negative selection will result in induction of apoptosis in many lymphocytes. If the lymphocyte has high affinity T cell receptor or B cell receptor. So, meron tayong tinatawag na transcription factor. Ito, transcription factor. AIRE. So, this transcription factor will participate in the deletion of potentially harmful self-reactive T cells. And if there is a mutation in these transcription factors, it can lead to autoimmune disorders or several self-reactive diseases. Central tolerance of T cells. So, diba, during their maturation in the thymus, T cells noted to recognize antigens with high avidity are being deleted, and some of the surviving cells in the CD4 lineage will develop into regulatory T cell. So, yung mga self-reactive CD4 plus T cells that see self-antigen in the thymus are not deleted, but sometimes are differentiated into regulatory T cells that are specific for those antigens. So, when the immature T cells recognize self-antigens in the thymus, again, it will result to cell death. Cell death or development of regulatory T cells that enter the peripheral tissues. So, T cell peripheral tolerance. So, ang normal T cell response natin is yung T cell natin will receive antigen presentation from antigen presenting cell like dendritic cells, and then those will become effector and memory T cells. So there can be different pathways of T cell tolerance: anergy, suppression, and deletion. So the signals involved in normal immune response, and these are the three major mechanisms of peripheral tolerance. So peripheral tolerance is the mechanism by which the mature T cells that recognize the self-antigens in peripheral tissues are rendered incapable of subsequently responding to that antigen. So your peripheral tolerance mechanisms are the ones that are responsible for T cell tolerance to tissue-specific self-antigens. So again, ano yung mga mechanisms natin? Anergy, suppression, and deletion. So anergy is the functional unresponsiveness. Suppression is when the T cells are being blocked in activation, and apoptosis, cell death. So this is an example of anergy in T cell tolerance. So, diba, ito yung normal antigen recognition. Magkakaroon siya ng proliferation and differentiation. In T cell anergy, after there is presentation of the antigen presenting cell to the T cell, there will be blocking of the signal, and what will happen is that the T cell will be unresponsive to signals. So the T cell responses that recognize self-antigen without co-stimulation becomes unresponsive to that antigen because of the block in the signaling from the TCR complex or their engagement of inhibitory receptors. So this signaling block may be a result of recruitment of different phosphatases to the TCR complex or the activation of different ligases that degrade that signaling protein. So the T cell will still live, it is still viable, but will not be able to respond to antigen presenting cells. Pathways of cell tolerance by T cells. So meron tayong clonal abortion, functional deletion, and T suppression. So in clonal abortion, the immature T cell clones may be aborted in a similar manner to B cells. In functional deletions naman, the subsets of your mature T cells are individually deleted, leading to the loss of one of the functions of that T cell group. Tapos, pag suppression, so your suppressor T cells will actively suppress the actions of the T cell subsets or B cells. Now, yung regulatory T cell natin, in this illustration, you can see the CTLA4 mediated inhibition of the antigen presenting cells by the T cells. So, one of the proposed mechanisms used by T cells to inhibit APCs involves the signaling between CD80-86 receptor and the CTLA4. So, the engagement will result to decreased expression of this receptor, and there will be changes in the transcription. So the IL-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha will have decreased expression, and the T cells will absorb interleukin 2 through a certain receptor. So ang absorption ni IL-2 happens through the CD25 molecule, and it will make inhibitory cytokines that act on nearby T cells. So the regulatory T cells are generated by self-antigen in the thymus and by antigen recognition in the peripheral lymphoid organs as well. So the development and the survival of these T regulatory cells will require IL-2 and transcription factor FOXP3. So in the peripheral tissues, the regulatory T cells will suppress activation and effector functions of other self-reactive and potentially pathogenic lymphocytes. So this is another illustration showing the inhibition by your regulatory T cells. So, meron tayong different steps wherein the regulatory T cells suppress immune response. So, what are the other mechanisms that are being described which are important in the suppression of the immune system or tolerance, not suppression lang pure. So, pwedeng inhibitory cytokines or cytokines and contact-mediated effect on APCs. So, yung regulatory T cells natin will produce yung mga anti-inflammatory IL-10 and also TGF-beta. So, these inhibit immune response. And your regulatory T cells will also inhibit the ability of the APCs to stimulate T cells. So your T cells are important focus of research in understanding CD4 and CD8 lymphocytes. And makikita nyo dito na important yung expression of FOXP3. So, immunologic tolerance naman by the B lymphocytes. So, the immunologic tolerance in B lymphocytes are necessary to maintain unresponsiveness to the thymus-independent self-antigens like polysaccharides and lipids. And there are experimental studies that reveal the multiple mechanisms in which our B cells abort maturation and activation. So what are the different pathways of immunologic tolerance in B cells? So meron tayong tinatawag na seasonal abortion in which yung low concentrations of multivalent antigens will cause the immature clone to abort. So as an immature B cell matures to the antibody forming cell, it will become resistant to tolerization, and at the same time, the form of antigen presentation which will produce tolerance will vary. So that type of tolerance is induced and is dependent on the maturity of the cell. So next pathway is clonal exhaustion. So there are repeated antigenic challenges with T and independent antigen. So it might remove all mature B cell clones. Kaya clonal exhaustion. Functional deletion naman is that there is an absence of T helper cells with the presence of a T-dependent antigen. So this prevents mature B cells from functioning normally. Or last naman, pwedeng mayroon tayong blockade from antibody. So if there are high concentrations of T-dependent antigens blocking the receptors of the cell, so hindi tayo makaka-release ng antibody through your B cells. Ang central tolerance ng B cells happens in the bone marrow. So there can be receptor editing, so we will produce a non-self-reactive B cell, or there will be reduced receptor expression. So just like yung T cell, there can also be anergy in B cells. Remember that the central tolerance, ang first step ng central tolerance is elimination. Now, your B cells that encounter self-antigens in the peripheral tissues will become anergic or die by apoptosis. And in some situations, recognitions of self-antigens will trigger inhibitory receptors that prevent B cell activation. So sometimes, even though there is a technical elaborate system of self-tolerance for those self-destructive lymphocytes, they can still make their way to peripheral organs, or they can still evolve during development of adaptive immunity. So it was noted that there are lymphocytes with specificity to self-antigens, and they are not rare or uncommon in the periphery. So there can be two factors that contribute to that? Not all self-antigens are expressed in the central lymphoid organs, so that's why some self-reactive T cells, self-reactive immune cells can still go through the peripheral organs. And there is also a threshold requirement for the affinity to self-antigens before the clonal deletion is triggered. So, meron yung mga weakly self-reactive clones that will survive the apoptosis process. So, because of that, there is still safeguarding of our immune system, and that happens outside of the primary lymphoid organs. So those are the process we call under the peripheral tolerance. So this happens in secondary lymphoid organs or at tissue sites where there is increased self-antigen expression. So same lang yung mechanisms under peripheral tolerance, immune suppression, and immune cell deletion. So these are the factors that determine the immunogenicity and tolerogenicity of protein antigens. So factors: persistence, portal of entry or location, the presence of adjuvants, the properties of antigen presenting cells. So pag short-lived ang antigen, meaning high likely that there is stimulation of the immune response. Portal of entry, subcutaneous, intradermal, they favor stimulation of the immune response. And when there are adjuvants present, so these are they heighten the immune system, so it will trigger immune response. And if there are high levels of co-stimulators. So aside from fetal exposures, the factors that promote tolerance rather than stimulation of the immune system will include the following. So now we go to immune regulation. So kanina, immune tolerance. Now we will discuss immune regulation. So there is what we call immunoenhancement or immunopotentiation. So this involves potentiating effect of your immunoenhancer. So there is augmentation of immune responsiveness by immunization or other means. So ano yung other means? It can be that there are increasing rates at which the response occurs, and we can also elevate the magnitude or increase the duration of the response. So this is a difference between a primary and a secondary response. So at first exposure to antigen, hindi pa ganun ka intense ang immune response. But when there is a secondary exposure to antigen, because there was previous development of memory B cells, immediate and mas heightened ang immune response. So in immunoenhancement or immunopotentiation, there are different non-specific potentiators. So we call adjuvants as substances that enhance the immunogenicity of the molecules without altering their chemical composition. So there is increase in the efficiency of macrophage that process the antigen. There is also prolonging of the exposure to that antigen, and there is also amplification of the proliferation of immunocompetent lymphocytes by enhancing the lymphokine activity. So, example natin ng adjuvant is the Fronds adjuvant. So, this is a classic adjuvant used in experimental animals. And ang emulsifying agent of this adjuvant is paraffin or mineral oil. So, this is developed by Jules Frond. And their antigen is emulsified in the mineral oil. So, meron tayong tinatawag na incomplete and complete Fronds adjuvant. So, one benefit lang of adjuvant is that there is a reduced required amount of antigen and prolongation of the phase of active immunoglobulin synthesis by months. So, yung incomplete Fronds adjuvant increases the humoral antibody response about 100-fold. While yung complete adjuvant will markedly enhance both humoral and cell-mediated immunity. So, example, yung BCG, so it causes macrophage activation and enhances NK cell activity. So, BCG yun yung binibigay sa atin at birth as an immunization against mycobacterial infection of extrapulmonary tuberculosis. So, these are the different classes of adjuvants. So, yung water in oil, precipitants and absorbents, they delay release of antigen and they prolong lymphoid tissue exposure to antigen. So, these are the examples. So, meron tayong tinatawag na mitogens in which they increase clonal expansions of T or B cells during an immune response. So, these are noted examples. So, in your reading, basahin nyo kung sino ba dito yung nagkukos ng clonal expansion for T cell, B cell, and for both. I-ano nyo yun. Basahin nyo sa inyong references. So, we also have specific potentiators. So, yung helper factors, so these are secreted by T cells after interaction of the antigen. And yung transfer factors naman, so, the antigen is specific dialyzable extract of immune T cells that is capable of transferring cell-mediated immunity. Meron din tayong immunogenic RNA. Also, these are extracted from lymphoid tissues after antigen injections. And it appears to be an antigen receptor complexed with cellular RNA, which increases immunogenicity of a molecule. Now, the immune suppression naman is baliktad syempre sa immune enhancement. So, immune suppression is the reduction in a large portion of immune responsiveness. It can be by physical means, chemical and biologic means, or the immunosuppression associated with diseases. So, immune suppression can be done through physical means, for example, surgical manipulation. So, we can remove peripheral lymphoid tissues and actual tissues, remove lymph nodes and lymphoid cells and the connective tissues. However, it has little effect on the immune system responsiveness. So, the lymph nodes are too diffuse to be removed completely by surgical procedures. So, anything that develops or anything removed after immunologic development will have very little effect on the immune competence. So, pwede din ionizing radiation to damage lymphoid organs and bone marrows. But it also has negative effect on the normal tissues itself. Pwede din chemical and biologic means by lymphocytic agents. So we can track the expression of the immune response, and it is more effective in disrupting the initiation of the immune response. Pwedeng lymphocytotoxic agents, wherein we give antimetabolites or alkylating agents to prevent either DNA synthesis or cross-linking of DNA strands to block replication. Pwede rin magbigay tayo ng antibiotics. So, these are given to suppress graft rejections during tissue transplants. Or steroids. So, steroids can be lymphocytic in animals, but in humans, it is immunosuppressive and is anti-inflammatory. So, pwede rin yung antibodies. So, antibodies will react with lymphoid cells to produce immune suppression of the cell-mediated immunity. So, these are different examples of immune suppression associated with diseases. So, meron tayong tinatawag na Bruton's agammoglobulinemia. So, this is the failure of the development of the B-cell humoral immunity. So, antibody production is affected. And the George syndrome naman is the failure of the development of the third and fourth pharyngeal pouches during embryogenesis. So, bakit siya important? Kasi dyan galing yung thymus. So, there can be recurrent viral diseases. And lastly, pwede din na malignancy. So, lymphomas might disrupt normal lymphocyte functions, rendering them immunosuppressed. And pwede rin infections. So, most common example is your HIV infection. Most profound example of immune suppression. So this makes the host susceptible to fatal infections caused by opportunistic pathogens because of immune suppression. And yung measles and certain viral diseases can cause transient depression in cell-mediated immunity. That's why if my measles or my viral disease, mas susceptible ka to certain infections as well. And malnutrition, the most sensitive part of the immune system that is affected by your malnutrition is the cell-mediated immunity. So those are the different mechanisms and pathways of immune suppression and tolerance. I hope you learned a lot in this video lecture, and next we will be discussing the actual immunodeficient na mga disorders. Thank you.